Okay, now we get to the scariest topic of the Middle Ages, probably. This was not in our Middle Ages notes video because I usually talk about it a little bit separately because there's a lot that goes with the bubonic plague. So you may have heard of the plague. It's also sometimes called the Black Plague or the Black Death, and we'll get to why it has these different names. But this is an incredibly devastating plague that ran through Europe during the Middle Ages and all of Eurasia, actually. So it was rampant all over that continent. So it is considered the most devastating natural disaster in European history. So when it was occurring, people were so horrified by the plague because they didn't understand what was going on. This is a time when medical knowledge was extremely limited to the point where it's scary to us today because they knew so little and they just didn't understand what was happening. So to them, this seemed like an evil force. So there was a spiritual side to how people viewed it. So here's a quote from a survivor of the plague talking about what it was like. So he says, "So nature killed many through corruptions. Death came driving after her and dashed all to dust. Kings and knights, emperors and popes. He left no man standing, whether learned or ignorant. Whatever he hit stirred never afterwards. Many a lovely lady and their lover knights swooned and died in sorrow of death's blows. For God is deaf nowadays, and will not hear us, and for our guilt he grinds good men to dust." Now, this is a quote from a survivor of the plague, and it has so much in it that tells us about the plague itself, how it affected people, and the after effects, even for those who survived. So we see in just this short quote several things. First, we see that it was seen as a spiritual evil force, basically. So you see here the personification of death and nature. Also, we see that it affected everyone, regardless of social class. So emperors and popes, knights, kings, everyone, whether they were high class, low class, learned, ignorant. And then it also kind of hints at the sadness and the tragedy of people dying, so many people dying, and people at very young ages, and people who are really at the height of their life. And at the end, it gives us this idea of how people felt, because remember, in the Middle Ages, people were very religious. And so a couple of the elements of that in relation to the plague is, one, that they saw it as punishment for sin, and two, in experiencing the plague and crying out to their God and praying and seeking religious comfort and not getting it, not seeing any protection from it, and just seeing death and devastation around them, they became very cynical about their religion and they started to lose their faith. And so you're going to see that as an impact of the plague. So what were the symptoms of the plague? Well, it started as an infection of the lymph nodes, specifically under the arms, and you would see these big growths pop up on people like you see in these pictures here. And the growths were called buboes. So that's where the name bubonic plague comes from. Other symptoms included seizures. You saw the color of the skin darken and change, so it would turn red and then dark and then become black. And that's where the other names of this plague come from. High fevers and hallucinations were also symptoms of the plague. So it was very painful, very difficult to experience, and just extremely excruciating. Now, how did it come about? How did it spread? So many people think that it spread via fleas that came to Europe on rats. And so the majority of people believe that Italian merchants who were having a lot of ships come in, remember those Italian port cities we talked about in our other set of notes, they were getting a lot of ships in for trade, and those ships had rats on them, and those rats had fleas, and the fleas carried the disease with them. And so they believe that when these ships came into port, sometimes they would come in with people who had died on the way over of the plague, and then it would spread from there. So many people believe Italian merchants brought the plague back with them to Sicily in October of 1347 from traveling to China. And by the end of that year, the plague had spread rapidly through southern Italy and southern France. Now, another theory about how the plague spread was that the Mongols, who were a group of nomadic warriors, used the plague in biological warfare. And it is said that they, in some fights, when they would come into an enemy city and the Mongols had been hit by the plague and many of their people had died, they would launch the dead bodies of those who died of the plague into the city to spread the disease, which is an early form of biological warfare. So then how did they stop it? Well, they didn't, right? They didn't understand what was going on, what it was, or how it was being spread. It was a mystery because they didn't have much knowledge of biology yet. So it just took time and eventually it vanished on its own. Now, during the Middle Ages, doctors did exist, but they were very untrained. They didn't have much education, and a lot of them still based a lot of their practices on superstition and, things that nowadays we don't really take seriously. So a lot of doctors of the time, they used very unsophisticated techniques like bloodletting, which is when you cut someone open and let them bleed because you believe that that's going to release toxins from the blood. They've got to let the blood out. Or boil lancing, things that nowadays are seen as unsanitary and very dangerous. And they also did things like they burned herbs and used rose water and vinegar, and they believed that those were ways that you could cure ailments. So doctors, eventually they learned enough that the plague could spread, it was contagious. So this is where you get that plague doctor costume that many of us have seen maybe on Fortnite or video games, but this was really how they dressed, and it's very interesting. So they covered themselves as much as they could. So they had a hat, they covered themselves all the way with leather, thick fabrics, so that they believed that the disease couldn't get through that. They wore these masks that make them look almost like crows to me, like it has a long beak, and the idea was that you couldn't get close enough to breathe the same air. And they would examine patients from a distance using a stick, so they wouldn't even touch them. And this was after a while, so at first they didn't realize that that was how it spread, and so you see them sort of touching people and, oh no, that's how it spread at first, and eventually they did learn a little bit about it and changed their practices based on that. And they also wore glasses or goggles to protect their eyes. So then what are the theories about the plague? Well, at the time, people saw this as God being angry with people for sin, bringing about the end of the world. They thought it was the apocalypse. They thought maybe the devil cursed the earth. A lot of the theories at the time were tied to religion because everyone was very religious. Nowadays, the theories suggest that trade spread it very rapidly, and at the time there wasn't enough knowledge or technology to control that spread, so it spread far too quickly for people to keep up with. That also during the Middle Ages, living conditions weren't very sanitary. It was very filthy. People lived in huts with dirt floors, and there were a lot of rats around, and so that fed the spread of disease. And even conspiracy theorists have suggested that this had something to do with aliens and that they were depopulating the earth. So actually, the origins of the Grim Reaper come from the Middle Ages, where people said that they thought they saw hooded figures out in the fields waving around a hissing scythe, which is this is a scythe, and that happened right before the people started dropping dead in the village, so they believed that that was some sign that was some sort of being that was bringing death to the area. So you start to see the artwork of the time become very dark and sinister. You see a lot of skeletons and hooded figures and death and fear. It becomes a lot more spooky. So what are the effects of the plague? Well, first of all, out of about 75 million people that were alive at the time, 38 million died. That is incredibly high. That is a huge amount. a huge portion of the population. In some places, entire villages were destroyed and entire cities were wiped out by the plague. Another effect is that anti-Semitism, which is prejudice and hatred toward Jews specifically, was increased. Now, you might ask why. And this is because during this time, people wanted someone to blame, right? They were scared, they were in pain, they were depressed and fearful, and they wanted someone to put the blame on. That makes it sometimes easier to deal with these kinds of things when you don't know what's going on. And so there's something called the scapegoat theory. And a scapegoat is someone you blame when you have no one to blame. And so at this time, people would take Jews and torture them and get them to confess to poisoning the well or causing the plague in some way. And that made them feel better because they had someone to blame. And so you saw a lot more violence against Jews during this time. Trade also declined, obviously, right? That's something that, you know, people weren't moving around and interacting as much. And we talked about how people's their faith in Christianity decreased significantly. And we also talked about how art became a lot more dark and disturbing. So you're probably actually seeing a lot of connections between the bubonic plague and what we're experiencing now with the coronavirus. So this is a difficult topic to talk about right now because it kind of hits different, right? So in previous years when I've taught this to students, it's been something that happened centuries ago that really, you know, it was kind of crazy to think about, but nowadays it's a lot more real to us. So it's an interesting connection to make. What similarities or differences do you see between the bubonic plague and how people responded to that and the effects of that? And how do you think that ties into what we're experiencing now?